We are very excited to have today's event where we're going to look at the Africa, China, and the US in the Biden era. Now it's well over 100 days since the new administration was launched out there in Washington, D.C. Obviously, even though we are a couple of days into the new administration, in fact, we are over 100 days now, but the excitement is still there. And that part of that excitement is that there's going to be a reset of the foreign policy, the Biden foreign policy towards Africa. And that, in fact, means that a reset will be across board. It will be overarching. It will touch many bases. And one of the major bases or issues or areas of geopolitical engagement that definitely will be implicated and impacted and will be of significance is China, the Middle Kingdom, which is a key competitor of the US geopolitically, but also specifically so on the continent, where we see lots of competition, much more than compromise in terms of the interests of China and the interests of the US on the continent. But the continent also has its own interests towards these two powers and their allies globally. And therefore, this is a very interesting topic. And where there's interest, you usually find a journalist right there, because journalists are the ones who bring us all this news and information in terms of breaking news, but all the way to commentary and analysis in terms of footage and so forth. And in fact, these days we talk of digital journalists, meaning that even tweeting and posting on Facebook on these relations, Africa, US, and China, is critical. So we thought that for this particular webinar, we'll particularly focus on reporting issues, skills, and strategies. Because even as we talk about the issues, we really want to understand how African journalists specifically are able to cover this complex relationship in a manner that illuminates, throws light, sheds light on the relations, and ensures that African interests perhaps are understood, appreciated, and implemented even by policymakers, local government level, but also scholars and the general public that just wants to understand the relations. So we are glad that you could join us. And without further ado, I want to invite our colleague, Barry van Wyk, from the WITS Journalism Department, and more specifically, the Africa-China Reporting Project. The WITS Africa-China Reporting Project is a partner in this particular activity, and there are a few other elements allied to this that we'll be working on. And so we are excited that we can partner even across the WITS departments and centers, and in also bringing in the scholar journalists that will be speaking to us. So Barry, please welcome and give us a couple of words.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. It's great to be part of this panel, even by only means of an introduction. It's really also great to see this panel of African experts and journalists and academics to be able to discuss this really important topic, a topic that really is incredibly important for the relationship between China, Africa, and the US. What's happening, and the new political trends that are happening now are really going to influence Africa a lot. And it's really going to be interesting to listen to what people have to say here today and what people are discussing. So I'm not going to say much. I'll just say that, Bob, of course, you're an old colleague of us at the Africa-China Reporting Project going back several years. You played a big role in the Africa-China Reporting Project as well before moving on to this new center, the African Center for the Study of the United States at WITS. So it's very gratifying to see that this is a collaboration between two centers at the University of the Witwatersrand. So the Africa-China Reporting Project has been in existence now for more than 10 years already. We are based at the Journalism Department of the university. And essentially what we do is we provide facilitation and capacity building for journalists. So we, in other words, we support journalists for training, to undergo training, to understand China, to understand to the tools and to have the network and the skills to be able to report on China, and really to be able to tell Africa's stories and to be telling the ground level stories about what's happening really about Africa. How can Africa optimize its relationship with China? What is China doing in various African countries? what really is going on in various regions, various countries, and we look at it from the ground level perspective, to look at from community to community, what is really happening on ground level, and how are Africa's people benefiting or not, or what might the case be. So as I said, we've been in existence now for more than 10 years. We've provided over 200 reporting grants to journalists. We've had several workshops around Africa and in China. We have been able to support a large number of journalists to provide, to make a media impact, to inform the public. And of course, in this day and age, one of the things that we're doing is to do these webinars, and it's great for us to have, like I said before, it's great for us to have this collaboration with the Center of the United States at WITS. So I don't think there's too much more I can say. I mean, everybody who's interested can please have a look at our website, africachinareporting.co.za. We also have a new training website for journalists that you'll be able to access from there. And thank you, Bob. I think that's all from me. I'll mute myself and listen to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. I think what Barry is not saying is that not many years ago he was my boss, and he's being very humble about it, but that's fine. I think just taking it from Barry's, the spirit with which Barry has introduced this talk, we ought not skirt around the problem too much, or the issue too much. Rather, let's launch into it. And to help us launch is actually Dr. Cliff Mboya, someone I've known for a long time back from our days in Nairobi, but he's just finished his PhD, in fact, in China at Fudan University. And I think those of you who are familiar with Fudan know that it's one of, it's the Harvard of China, just on the outskirts of Shanghai city. And Cliff completed his PhD last year in the areas of public diplomacy, development communication, obviously China-Africa relations, and he has some working knowledge. In fact, he's vast in this whole area of Belt and Road Initiative, issues to do with the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, and international organizations more broadly. And Cliff is in a very good position because he actually worked at the Chinese embassy in Nairobi before going on for his PhD studies. And so, Cliff, we want to hear how you link China, the US, and Africa, all of them complex areas, and unpack them for journalists. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that kind of introduction. And I'm happy to share my ideas and views on this relationship. It's a very interesting one. My interest has been on China-Africa relations for a long time. And I think with the contemporary issues arising and the US coming in a strong way, I think it's important to also have a very good understanding of US-China relations so that we have a comparative analysis. But then going into the presentation itself, I think it is evident now that Africa finds itself at the center of a great power competition between the US and China. And this is kind of synonymous with the Great Game, the Great Game that existed between the British Empire and the Russian Empire sometime towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and this great power competition was over Afghanistan and the neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. And we know what happened. Who lost? It's Afghanistan, of course. And we are seeing this coming, manifesting in Africa. Today the United States and China are in a fierce competition of, things like trade, technology, democracy, human rights. And when you look at it from a soft power perspective, this is playing out in Africa more than anywhere else in the world. So if you look at, the rhetoric coming from Beijing and Washington, it suggests that the two countries are some kind of a new scramble for Africa. So while China's policies towards Africa are geared towards improving its attractiveness, and gaining some political and economic influence on the continent, you find that on the US side, especially during the previous administration, the foreign policy priorities were mostly about containing China's influence and commercial engagements on the continent. And this begs the question, what is the role of Africa and us Africans, journalists, academics, professionals, like, are we pawns in this geopolitical game of chess, you know? What is our role in all this, you know? So I'll go directly to the topic because this was about Africa, China, US in the Biden era. So for me, the most relevant issue here was the fact that we have a new administration in place, and this administration is expected to influence the relationship in various ways. We know that the Trump administration had identified a strategic competition with China as a core objective in Africa. And in most instances, when the US House of Representatives or other departments were discussing Africa, it was very surprising to find that these discussions became more about China and less about Africa. You know, and with the new administration, we hope there'll be a few changes. But even looking at the new president's first foreign policy speech, he made it clear that he views China as its most significant national security challenge, and that has an implication on the foreign policy. So this suggests that the new administration and Biden will largely follow Trump's policies. And this was kind of evident in the high-level meeting in Alaska, where, you know, the usual rhetoric and accusations back and forth happened, you know, issues to do with human rights, democracy, and, you know, the international system and rules and such like discussions. So personally, I expect America's policy towards China to remain almost the same under Biden. And while he's kind of a different character, you know, Trump was a bit rash and unpredictable, or often undiplomatic. But what kind of changes do we expect in this trilateral relationship? So it has been indicated by the new administration that despite the geopolitical tensions, you know, they are willing to cooperate when it is in the national interest of the US. And I think this is very key for African journalists, because it shows that we need to focus on this and try to pave way for this to happen in the continent. You know, there are also indications that the administration plans to steer away from, you know, Trump's unilateralism, you know, with the terms like America is back, you know, so time will tell, but then those indications are there. And there are also indications of a more cooperative approach. They talk about boosting multilateral and repairing alliances. Well, this could mean anti-China alliance, which also has implications on the policies that China will have towards Africa, and I hope will not be expected to pick sides, you know. And we also expect the US to design a new policy framework for Africa, and this will mean China will also review its policies towards Africa. But then you see that shows this zero-sum mentality that the two powers have, you know. And also interesting is the fact that Biden has promised to host the Global Summit for Democracy. And, you know, this will pose a direct challenge to the policies that China has in Africa. So it will be very interesting. But I think overall, we expect the US and China to remain in a state of extreme competition in the continent. So what should our journalists be aware of when covering this relationship with that kind of setting or geopolitical environment? So for me, I think a big part of the reset of the US foreign policy in Africa will be determined by how the administration is going to frame the issues of China's presence in the continent. You know, during the previous administration, as I've mentioned, you know, they looked at Africa from a Chinese lens, you know, like China's influence, and instead of coming with an independent policy for Africa, you know. So information will continue to be weaponized for geopolitical gains. You know, we have state and non-state actors who have entered into the information game. We have social media, we have nationalistic citizens, and they're all trying to find new ways to deceive public opinion so that they achieve their political goals or geopolitical goals. And this comes through media and social media, technology, and other kind of engagement. But ideally, the media is the channel. So we expect from the Chinese side, we expect the diplomats, the state officials, the media, and even other individuals, to try and foster some particular perceptions about China in the continent, and even the perceptions about Africa and the relationship with the US, and also China and this relationship with Africa. So these initiatives must be understood as deliberate attempts to strengthen China's political, economic, and maybe even military influence. This is in direct competition with the US. However, China remains vulnerable to negative counter-narratives from the US. And, when it comes to media and information war, I think the US has historical advantages. We have the Hollywood effect, the CNN effect, which also influence our media in a big way. You remember the death trap narrative that has been going on for a while, So this kind of simplistic or zero-sum mentality does not align with the reality on the ground, Not only is the US-African relationship it is not, okay, it is competitive, but it is, there are some areas of complementarity that we can focus on. And, we can begin to tell our story, because as much as they have different interests on the continent, there are areas where the two can cooperate for the mutual benefit. And this has been emphasized by scholars recently. My friend Eisenman, David Shane have been talking about this for a while now. So I think this provides an important opportunity for our journalists to explore this for the benefit of the continent, So how should they cover this relationship, So for me, I think our biggest challenge is we do not have effective policies by our media houses and our journalists to cover this relationship, and the debate is just beginning. So this is an opportunity to look at this critically and come up with both short-term and long-term strategies of how to cover this. This could be through training programs, collaboration and things like that, so that we deal with the misinformation and misrepresentation of Africa, especially in the West, So through that, we can incorporate African perspectives and African agency. We need a strong African response to shape the debate, rather than rely on maybe editors from Beijing or Washington to shape the narrative, because sometimes we get lost in the competition and forget about our priorities, So I mentioned that we need an African position on this. And I think our journalists also need to, we have this media culture that is anti-government, we focus on the negative too much. I think our journalists can partner with government. They can partner with the research organizations and social and other political groups, so that we nurture our own maybe goals, aspirations, so that this articulated clearly from a vision of progress for Africa, kind of like the things we learn from our development journalism courses. This can go internationally, because our media need to be alive, to not just its commercial interest, but the professional responsibilities, because some of these are professional issues, because, I believe issues of national interest or, the image of your country, patriotism, they play a part. As much as people talk about freedom of the media, the government can work hand in hand with the journalists and the media, especially in Africa, And we should, there's this concept of peace journalism, not peace in the sense of war, but then I think the concept can help us deal with this issue, because, it describes a style of reporting where you seek to de-escalate a conflict by focusing on these transformative ideas. And this means going back to the community at the grassroots and trying to, as much as you shape the ideas, you also get feedback on their priorities and their interests. So as I wind up, I think we need to look at issues of ethical journalism, things to do with accuracy, independence, objectivity. These are things that are well known, but I think sometimes because of economic interest and influence, sometimes you find that we continue to propagate narratives that are not our own. And because of time, I will just end with a quote. And I got this quote from Journalism 101. And it says, if someone says it's raining and another says it's dry, it's not a journalist's job to quote them both. That is what we tend to do. I think your job is to look out of the window and find which one is true. And I think that is one of the things that we should remind our journalists, because sometimes you open the newspapers and you find, an article that has been picked from the Wall Street Journal or Chinese politician says, and it is covered like that. And you find most people do not have that time to begin analysis and things like that. So I think those are some of the things that we should start implementing as we try and forge an African agenda towards this trilateral relationship. So because of time, I will end there, and I'm looking forward to the discussions afterwards. So thank you, Bob, for your time.
Thanks, Dr. Mboya, and I think those were very solid comments. Later on, when we discuss, we would like to hear from you, perhaps towards the end, on issues to do which documents and which specific policies. If you can name for us the specific policies and documents that journalists should actually look at, because journalists are in the business of looking for news and information.
Yes.
And I think we take it that you talk about the Democracy Summit that Biden is putting together will be an affront on China almost frontally. Yes. And so for journalists, where should we be looking for this information on the Democracy Summit? Where in the US should we seek out this information? And I think we'd also like to hear from you later on the specific state and non-state actors, because you use those two terms. Yes. And so specifically, which state actors and which non-state actors. But for now, we are very glad to have our colleague Puso Kedidimetse, who is based in Botswana and has an interest, research and practice in media, communications, and obviously issues to do with democracy, politics, and economics. He holds a master's degree in conflict resolution, having worked on matters to do with security in the DRC, and his most recent academic activity has been at Stellenbosch University, where he got a certificate in political economic risk analysis. Without further ado, maybe let's invite Puso so that he can also then give us perspectives on Africa, the US, and China in the Biden era from a journalistic perspective. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, everyone. It's nice to meet you. Yes, I think the issue of the US, China, and Africa for journalists is a very complicated one, in the sense that the two powers, like my colleague has already said, are in competition. Each and every one of these wants to exert its influence on the African continent. And it's up to journalists to analyze the actions of the two superpowers and see where the truth lies. One of the biggest challenges that I think journalists have in Africa is that dominant narratives, especially in the media, on China from a Western perspective. A lot of African journalists are inclined towards Western media because of centuries of exposure to Western American media and other media houses from the West, like CNN, for instance. However, China has been a late entrant in the media, in the global media landscape. With we saw the entry of CCTV and CGTN, I should think, yeah, if I'm correct. So what journalists need to do when covering these issues is to look at the dominant narratives. There is a dominant narrative right now that China is an autocracy. So what journalists need to do is try and understand the Chinese system without using the Western lens. Journalists in Africa need to understand how the Chinese system, the political system, works. Because without understanding the Chinese political system, it is going to be difficult for journalists to understand US-China relations. And secondly, journalists need to understand the dominant narrative and the value systems that they've been using to study China. The Biden administration has laid its groundwork for how it's going to confront China, especially in terms of its foreign policy. Biden says President Xi sees autocracy as the future, while the US sees democracy as the future. This is a loaded statement that journalists need to interrogate and try to understand from a position of independence. I think one of the challenges that journalists are going to have in covering the US, China, and Africa is that President Biden comes into office after President Trump's term of office. We know President Trump and his behavior towards France, towards China. He wanted to project an image of this big man who's going to take down China. So President Biden, as I analyze his foreign policy projections, is trying to show American audiences that in as much as Trump was direct when dealing with China, he is not going to be seen to be weak. So he's going to try and maintain some of the rhetoric that President Trump initiated. However, I foresee a chance for cooperation between the two nations, because President Trump's conduct of foreign relations, because of his experience in the Senate, at a lower level or in the background, I see a lot of cooperation between the two, China and the United States. And this is an opportunity for African journalists to try and understand beyond the rhetoric what is happening beneath the surface. Are there areas of cooperation between these two superpowers? So a journalist covering Africa, China, and the US needs to understand that there's something that lies beyond the rhetoric. What is it that the Biden administration is doing diplomatically? Obviously, as African journalists, we are going to have to work very hard. We know that the media in Africa has been affected by since the 2008 global economic recession. Media houses are struggling financially. And China and the US are competing by affording journalists and media houses training opportunities. African journalists need to be very careful with these sponsored media trips to China, media trips to Washington. They need to be objective. Try by all means to be objective, because sometimes it's difficult when you have an all expenses paid trip to come and report objectively, lest you burn the bridges. So journalists in Africa need to be very careful when reporting about policies from the US and Africa and their implications for the African continent. This they can do by comparing the value systems, political value systems of the two countries, and not relying on the past dominant narratives that have been used by the Chinese to describe the US, or that has been used by the US to describe the Chinese system. There's an issue right now that is predominant in African media, but it's perpetuated by Western media, that China just wants to invest in African countries. It cares less about human rights. As journalists, I think we need to be careful because, as you know, the Chinese have their own concept of human rights. So as a journalist, if you're going to cover a human rights story involving China, the starting point should be, what are human rights as per Chinese culture? Is the Chinese definition of human rights similar to the US definition of human rights? We know that the Chinese have argued when they argued against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that human rights should be country specific. They should take into consideration the cultures of different countries. So journalists covering these issues need to be aware of the Chinese perception of human rights, the American perception of human rights. We know that a lot of journalists in Africa are Western trained journalists, majority of them. And the thinking has been to follow the dominant narrative when it comes to analyzing Chinese conduct or Chinese operations in Africa. The other issue that we, as journalists, we need to look at and interrogate is the areas of cooperation. China and the US, I see them cooperating, especially on issues of security, maritime security, fighting issues such as piracy in the high seas. I also expect them to cooperate because it's beneficial to both of them on issues of terrorism, fighting terrorism in the African continent. And journalists covering these issues should be more inclined towards issues that are beneficial to Africa rather than issues that divide China and the US. So it is very important for the media in Africa that while they receive funding from both China and the US, they try and maintain their objectivity. China and the US they're fighting to have spheres of influence in Africa. But we know that the United States has been in Africa security measures, especially with regards to the US Africa Command. I see the US Africa Command as one of the areas where the US, especially under Joseph Biden, cooperating with the Chinese to deal with security issues, some of which affect Chinese interest in Africa, the Chinese investments in Africa. China and the US have the potential to cooperate under the auspices of the US Africa Command to protect their interests, because they both have interest in Africa. While the US has been in Africa for a very long time, through the USAID, and we know that in many countries, the US, especially in the health sector, has invested in sustainable health programs. We should also look at Chinese investments in health. You know, we have in African countries, especially in Botswana, you have these Chinese medical teams that are always coming after every 12 months. We need to interrogate those issues and see how they benefit the African continent. I think it is important, rather than focusing on the competition between China and the US, to focus on how African countries can position themselves to benefit from Chinese and US investments in Africa. I don't see China eclipsing the United States in America. That's my opinion, because the US has trained a lot of, even though China is aggressive in terms of training of African human resources, the US has trained a lot of African civil servants, some of the African elites who are now in positions of power. I think that trend is going to continue. And I think America is going to continue offering technical assistance for many programs, especially in the health sector. I'm also looking at the COVID-19 pandemic. Journalists should look at how the two countries are approaching the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the assistance coming to Africa with the rollout of the vaccine. We should be looking at how much the US is dedicating towards vaccine rollout to the African continent. Has that happened? How much is the Chinese doing in terms of COVID-19? Have they started rolling out and how many countries are benefiting? There's been a lot of talk about vaccine nationalism. Journalists in Africa should interrogate how vaccine nationalism is affecting African countries. And I think that would be my brief for now.
All right. Thank you very much, Puso. In fact, I was going to just say to stop you, but then we are talking about vaccine nationalism and COVID-19. So I thought that's an interesting topic. I'll give you a couple of minutes. But thank you very much for your intervention. I think now we want to invite our colleague Matsilele, who in fact is a master's student here at Wits University, working on a very interesting topic of the use of drones in journalism. So that's a cutting edge use leveraging technology for journalism. Amu is also a researcher here in our communications department here at the African Center for the Study of the US at Wits University. I could go on introducing Amu, but it's much better to let her speak. So Amu, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours. Right.
Thank you very much, Bob, and welcome to everyone who's listening in. So the position that I am taking is that we need to define the role of African journalists before we go any further. So for me, African journalists are journalists who are working for private or public African media houses in Africa. So from this, one can infer that the role of African journalists is to inform by giving balanced and fair information. We need to separate the role of the public and private media in Africa. Reason being, most public media houses are government-owned and produces mostly state propaganda, whilst in some cases, private media houses, which are independently owned, try to produce fair and balanced news. We must also look at how African media fails in terms of providing news and the kind of perceptions that they communicate. I'm sure my colleagues have said this. In South Africa, the role of media is constitutionally defined compared to other African countries, where the media is owned by the state and is mainly authoritarian. Reports have shown that Chinese journalism model has non-adherence to traditional journalistic standards. Propaganda is seen as a tool in educating and shaping the opinions. Since China follows a different editorial style from the other media companies with the Western media, it has resulted in China's involvement being scrutinized more than any other media outlets. Whilst for the US, they make use of the dominant watchdog media in their reporting. So given this geopolitical context of Africa, China, and the US, we can also infer that when it comes to the global play and the role of African media should play, the inference is they should play an objective and informative role in interrogating the trilateral relations between the three countries. But we also need to be very realistic. There is very little coverage or outflow of information that comes out of either public or private media from Africa. As the report from Africa Filter states, the report shows that the coverage on Africa and African news, current affairs, 80% of that report shows that the coverage comes from either CNN or CGTN. And the current news on foreign affairs is predominantly North-South. This is an issue that we really need to be worried about. I'll give an example. In China, China is interested in reporting about positive topics that benefit Chinese political and economic relationships with the countries that they are content. The same goes also for the United States. When they report on China, they are very critical of China. And what causes this? The cause is the global political economy of the media. So when it comes to information on news and foreign affairs, a lot of coverage is generated by media houses which are not African. If there is an African journalist, the journalist will be constrained by regulatory mechanisms, which makes information from Africa be defined by the Americans or the Chinese. An example is how Chinese strategy is to invest massively in African media through offering free content to African news channels in order to shape its positive image. But there is still room and possibility that African journalists can be critical of the relations between US and China and how separately US relates to China and how China relates to Africa. The Chinese media uses the charm defensive model when engaging with Africa to offset negative stereotyping from the West. The Chinese government fosters perspectives about the country through highly initiated, sophisticated initiatives such as CCTV or CTGN. These initiatives are being made to strengthen Chinese political power as a rival to the US. Hence the term soft power in an effort to counter the negative perceptions that are coming from the West. Chinese media presents in Africa a challenging and public diplomacy challenge. So, for example, China and Africa Press Exchange Center program, provisions for the training of about 1,000 African journalists. But you will see that with most of the visits from these exchange programs seem to be African journalists going to China rather than the Chinese journalists visiting Africa. Chinese poses also a challenge to the US across board because both China and the US have interest in the economic, political, military, technological developments, as my colleagues have highlighted. That is very important to note because quite often when China and US are competing in terms of Africa, they rarely cooperate. Even when it comes to sensitive, critical political issues, most of these issues are inherent in major power competition between China and the US. Rarely do we see the two countries working together on transnational issues, where both the US and China's cooperation is essential. Matters such as climate change, public health, and also combating pandemics. Another example that I'll give is the Mombasa-Nairobi deal. This is a good example to show where US and Africa clash when it comes to African interests. So it is very important for African media players to interrogate objectively both the role and the relations that China play and the role and the relations that the US has with African countries. Quite often in institutions, an example is the UN, China will always take a position that supports certain African countries. It will vote with African countries and the US will always rally with European countries. And that creates a conflict. Another example that I'll give is how the Chinese support to Africa is primarily in kind rather than in cash. An example is the PPEs that Chinese is giving to Africans. Whilst the assistance of EU and America is largely financial and focuses on the reallocation rather than on new fund mobilization. These are the things that African journalists need to question and deliberate on so that people understand what is going on. Several reports by media companies especially media companies from the US, have argued that the Chinese engagement in Africa is viewed as exploitative, especially in terms of the commodities sector. And they are known to flaunt human rights. As my colleague has already said, when we are looking at this issue of human rights, it needs to be by country, not the whole world, right? So Chinese state influence or control of their media approach is quite similar to some of the African state-owned stations. However, whether the interest at government level is monitored by a receptive audience, that is another issue altogether. Most of the initiatives you will see that are led by the US, private corporate companies are at the forefront. Western media is criticized for using cliches to portray Africa. US coverage of China is biased when they are dealing with topics that relate to Africa. An example, they are eager to challenge the Chinese development model in Africa. The same is being done also by Chinese media. So on what will change under the Biden era, the US needs to understand that attention is proportional to strategic interest. So the attention being given to Africa's growth initiatives will have to focus on strategic values and on the foundational principles of the US-Africa engagement. By asserting their commitment to Africa through shared prosperity, as they've stated, peace and security, democracy, and government. Some of the things that Biden is doing, for example, he has sent a peacekeeping envoy to Delgado in Mozambique. And Biden has also promised to restore the humanitarian support. So journalists need to question these things and they need to look into this. I'm sorry, I can see that I'm running out of time, so I'll quickly wrap up. So the recommendations that I'm giving for African media is that African journalists need to engage in meaningful debates surrounding the trilateral relationships. They need to examine and evaluate the relevance of any developmental projects to the country's needs. In order for African journalists to defend and protect African interests, we need to have a common interest. And unfortunately, we do not have a common interest. We do not have common African media in Africa. So it comes back to my definition, where African media is mostly national. And national media now needs to project the African interests, which is defined at trilateral level with organizations or in spaces such as the UN, SADC, ECOWAS, and IGAD. There should be more institutionalization of the role of African media. So as a starting point, we need to look at the relationship between China and Africa without including ourselves. Another good starting point is looking at Agenda 2063 as a mechanism to promote and defend the continent's collective interests. So we need to ask ourselves, what are those collective interests? If we also look at China's Belt and Road Initiative, they say their action plan is to improve regional integration and increase trade and economic growth. So as journalists, we need to get hold of these documents and look into what these documents are saying. And then from there, we will know if it will benefit Africa or not. Also, we need to look at Biden's foreign policy. What is the foreign policy saying? And lastly, we need to look at Senate Foreign Africa Affairs Committee and the House of Foreign Affairs Committee. And in those documents, we ask ourselves, what are the implications for Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amu. You have raised quite some pertinent, important issues, particularly very practical ones towards the end of Agenda 2063, which we are beginning to forget since it was launched a couple of years back, I think. But also, importantly, you know, the Senate and House Foreign Relations Committee and their work, because they do a lot of work on Africa, US, and journalists can draw from that and actually use those as sources. And even in terms of the people to interview, those politicians and so forth. I want now to bring in Gregory Gondwe, whom I met not too long ago of a project related to all these issues that we're discussing. He's an affiliate of the Department of Journalism at University of Colorado in Boulder, where he teaches media and related courses. I think Gregory is just on the tail end of his PhD, or if he has not done so, maybe Gregory will let us know if you are wrapping up your project or you are done. But the most interesting thing is that Gregory is originally from Zambia, but being based in Colorado, working on a Chinese topic, actually brings in 3 segments of the topic collectively. You know, Zambia has been one of the countries that has been, you know, great at the heart of these discussions. But obviously, Zambia is also an African country, so it's a reflection of the continent. Gregory is based in the US, working on a China topic. Without further ado, Gregory, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, so basically I work on China, and my dissertation is on that. I wrapped it up thanks to that. And this is what I also want to present today. You know, I'm one of the advocates for those that say, no, Africa, Africa, Africa. But after reading a lot of literature on the Chinese media in Africa and Chinese influence on the African media, I came to realize that there might be distinctions, and especially based on Zambia, which I think most of us know that China, or the Chinese conglomerate Star Times, now owns more than 60% of the government media, or maybe controls. You know, they say they are partnering, but in my opinion, that's not really some kind of partnering where, let's say, China comes to own a government media. So that actually sparked my interest, and I really wanted to see how that has influenced media performance in Zambia. You know, how are the locals being influenced? How are local journalists now reporting China across time? And I looked at the time frame from 2012 to 2018. And then the second thing that I actually identified as a gap in the literature is the approach that we take. You know, and in my opinion, I believe that in today's age, we also need, as journalists, to accommodate data journalism, you know, where we have to not only rely on interviews, but being able to, you know, analyze the data, because that's where most of the information or most of the subliminal messages reside. So basically, that's what I did. Then the third is I looked at the shift that has happened, you know, where, in my opinion, or based on the literature from the early 90s, you know, after independence, African journalists or African scholars started advocating for what they consider as an African media. You know, how should an African media look like? And in the early 90s, we see an advocate for Afri-ethics. That has been criticized, saying, no, that's not very practical. But in reality, none of the scholars disagree that there is an African value that can be implemented within African journalism. So those things actually inform what I'm looking at. And hence the main question that I have, and based on what I actually observed from Zambia, is how has the media in Zambia shifted its narrative to accommodate Chinese news agenda over a period of time? So that's the measurement, the first measurement I was doing. And then the second is the African media capable of telling an African narrative amidst such massive investment? So my findings were that most stories first focus on political matters, you know, and in my opinion, thus they disregarded issue-based events. Still, stories of voices of the local people were not really seen in stories about China. You know, So, I mean, that has been over time. So in 2012, we see some voices or China stories talking about, let's say, agriculture. But in 2017, the focus transforms to investment, and the focus is now on politics. You know, the government is doing this, the government is doing this, and the voices of the local are shattered. You know, and also I observed that the Chinese news agenda in the Zambian media increased collaboratively, with investment. So the more investment that was actually put in the Zambian media and in the Zambian government, the more stories we see of China, meaning that all the stories that are important or that are of value to the local people are being actually shuttered down, you know. And then also we see China in the stories. I also analyze the language and sentiment within these stories that I collected over time. And I come to see that China is now becoming the subject of the story. You know, in common English or basic 101 English grammar, the subject speaks to the object. So initially we had China being the object in the story or in a sentence, and now China is being the subject, meaning it's now speaking to Zambia other than being spoken to. So those were kind of some of the findings. Even another finding that I had was the transfer, because there are some arguments that no, China only partners with ZNBC, which is the government media, and media like religious are not influenced. But looking at the methods that I used of network analysis, I was able to identify the transfer of that influence into even community and religious media, you know, because of the connection that, let's say, religious media have to community media, and the connection that the community media have to private, and the private media have to with ZNBC. So those findings, I think, in my opinion, have implications. Like, you know, we see now China being privileged over the local voices. You know, the local narratives continue to pave way for Chinese news agenda. You know, and then the third is that now most stories about China are slowly, you know, also getting devoid of the ethnic considerations. You know, we see, like I said, the findings that we see is that the focus has been on politics, but politics, I know, encompasses a lot of things, but it also goes beyond, or it does sometimes ignore the voices of the local people. There are many things out there that are needed. There are stories about human rights. What energy or what effort are journalists putting towards that stories as opposed to politics? What could be done in this case? In my opinion, I believe that, you know, there should be both. First, African scholars should start looking at designing a rigorous curriculum that accommodates African values or African journalism reporting. I don't think we have argued as to whether that exists or not. It's just the implementation that is difficult to do. So, and also we need to understand that China and the US are just doing business, and we are not there to appease them. I think because we know that they're actually competing, that's the opportunity for African journalists to push for an African narrative. So both China and Africa, in this case, can help Africa design their own narrative. You know, and then also, to get into the market, because this is a marketing force, Africans should also market their own values, their own journalism. And in my opinion, I think authenticity, you know, the question is, how should an authentic story look like from Africa? You know, how can we differentiate ourselves from stories or designed stories from China and the United States? Probably if, let's say, we focus on in-depth reporting, we focus on developmental journalism, that might actually be of value. And in that way, a hybridity that actually Mejai calls for can actually happen in that manner. You know, And then I also think journalists, it's not about China or the United States doing something for African journalists, but journalists themselves should be accorded the agency of becoming social actors immersed in a particular context that directly ties to both local and the global. So the understanding of both the local and the global and putting them together should be the ultimate value of African journalists. And in that way, I think we are able to tell an African story. Then the last one would be probably reinforcing or teaching journalists to appreciate the African epistemologies, understanding the value other than just copying a story from outside there and bringing it out there, but us selling and acknowledging that the knowledge we have is also of value. Thank you. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Gregory. And I think your presentation emerges from research work, which is interesting. And it's hot off the press. So we think that this is interesting because then it helps us to get to very close to where the content is and therefore where the profession ought to go. And I think we'll have an interaction at some point when we go into the Q&A session. But I also like to take note that in fact, the Africa-China reporting project, which is part of this initiative today, as when we changed name in 2017 or 2016, I'm not very certain. One of the big ideas was that the project used to be called China-Africa Reporting Project. And it was decided it is better to call it Africa-China. And at the heart of it all was an African journalistic starting point, philosophical and so forth. And I think we'll go into that. But now I want to invite Adhere Otieno Kavins, who is our last speaker. He's been very patient, but we save the best for last, perhaps. And so we're very keen to listen to him. But quite interestingly, Adhere is currently a PhD candidate student at the Central China Normal University. Now, if you know the geography of China, when you say Central China Normal University, you mean Wuhan. Where some virus is said to have begun from. So maybe Adhere will start with that first of all to just let us know what happened or what's going on. But more importantly, I think Adhere is obviously being based, an African based in China, in Wuhan, has lived experience, which is current, which will bring to bear in his presentation. And so without further ado, Adhere, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bob. I hope you can hear me. Good. So starting off with, I think, a remark that you made with regards to my being in China. Yes, I'm a student at Wuhan. And with regards to what happened there is a very hot topic and a subject to a discussion that I think we've heard about since we started this webinar. But I think as a way of introduction, I would like to also appreciate the kind of insights that we've had from earlier speakers, and also to highlight the fact that certainly there is a renewed scrutiny in terms of U.S.-Africa relations following the election of Biden. And this is not happening without a context. Remember that former U.S. President Trump was a man whose actions were interpreted in Africa as quite unfortunate. His comments about African countries, talking about African leaders as corrupt, travel bans against specific African nationals, and not being able to visit the continent, never sending, serious or high-level officials, even at the cabinet level. None of them was coming over to the continent. And so when Biden was elected, there was a kind of optimism, and renewed hope that perhaps there's going to be some form of renewed cooperation with the continent. And this form of renewed cooperation was also looked at not in isolation, but with regards to other powers that are, cooperating with the African continent. And we have seen certain indications, early indications from the Trump administration with regards, Biden administration, with regards to what his stance, is about. And some of the early harvested indications include reversal of those travel bans, decision to rejoin WHO and COVAX facility, and this is quite critical, especially in the era of COVID. We are talking about Africa, and COVAX is a facility that was initiated really to assist African countries access these essential commodities called vaccines. And so the United States coming back to the game of WHO is something that is closely followed in Africa. He has also made direct contact with African leaders, from Kenyan president to the African Union leadership. In Ethiopia, his administration has made quite a number of contacts since he came into office. And so the question is, what's going to be different? And in my view, there are certainly going to be continuities. Just a change of administration doesn't really throw away the whole gambit of foreign policy formulation for a country. The national interest of US remains constant in many ways. And so I think from my point of view, there's going to be still a focus on things like governance and human rights. We have seen President Biden comments on Ethiopia and what's going on there. It's a bit of focus on human rights and how this should be done, the issue of democracy promotion when you talk about the Democracy Summit. And this just tells you the thinking behind the new administration in terms of what they would want to continue with. There is also a new and interesting idea about trade and investments. Remember that US is, for example, currently in talks with Kenya for a free trade agreement. There is also a feeling among a section of US officials that this trade cooperation should expand beyond Kenya, really, to target the African continent, especially in the backdrop of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So there are some of these new nuances that we are seeing coming out of Washington that sends a message in Africa, perhaps, that there is something that is going to be a little bit different, including the idea of multilateralism, shaking off the kind of nationalistic stance that we saw with the previous administration. But more importantly, there is the China factor, which a lot of people in this webinar have made reference to. As a matter of fact, most of the US officials' comments about Africa are tacit informations about China and what China is doing on the continent. And this is because China, for the last decade or so, has, since the launch of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in the year 2000, there has been a number of developments on the China-Africa front, including investments, including cultural exchanges, where China now is ranking as the most preferred destination, for example, for African students seeking to get higher education abroad, myself included. So these are some of the concepts that perhaps journalists in Africa should be asking themselves, what does this look like? So beyond the idea of the curriculum and the ethics of training, I'm trying to look at a journalist that is currently practicing in different African capitals, wondering how best can they do their job, I would want to approach it in terms of some of the challenges that perhaps are currently being experienced by these journalists in their ability to cover these stories effectively, especially the triangular approach when you talk about China, the USA, and Africa. And one of the biggest challenges, for example, raised by African journalists when covering China is the difficulty in getting information. That the sources are quite difficult to cultivate, so that you have a running story and you have a press time, turnaround time, and it takes time to get some feedback from the Chinese sources. Some of the challenges that have been laid include difficulties in understanding the agreements that China goes into with different African countries. The other is basically language. The difference, the cultural differences marked majorly by language, where most African journalists covering China are not able to speak Mandarin, and this is really in contrast to Western media outlets, which send journalists to China journalists who can speak Mandarin and therefore able to survive and understand the issues on the ground. So I think language barrier, the fact that China is politically, economically, and socially a little bit different from the continent, as well as distance, makes it very difficult for, I think, journalists on the continent to have a better understanding of what's going on in China and how best to cover this. And so the other challenge is the what we would call information hegemony, you know, where the dominant narratives that we've seen in the press are basically coming from the West. You know, African press can carry stories about Africa that are taken from wire services in the West. A story about Nairobi, you find a newspaper in Nairobi carrying it in the front page, but the source is maybe some Western media outlet and not local media outlets. And that's how huge the information hegemony, I think, in my view, in terms of how to best approach the task at hand. So what are some of the key skills that African journalists perhaps need to better, answer the quest to not let Africa once again be the pawn, in this game of great power politics? And I think we beyond the traditionally understood, journalistic best practices, objectivity, fairness, and all that. But I think today, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, the research skills is quite important, especially data mining skills, because a lot is going on, and some journalists do rely on talking points, while there is huge information out there lying in reports, on websites of key institutions that are thematic, dealing with very strategic issues about China, about US, and about Africa, that they could get if they only went out of their way to data mine this information. And of course, the other is, language skills, critical, for any journalist that intends to really properly cover China. From my research, only 2 countries, and that's Egypt and Morocco, have managed to send resident journalists to China, and they are basically, I think, in Beijing and Shanghai. There are only 2 cities that have resident African journalists who are registered to report from China. And this is a major challenge, and maybe a call for other media organizations to try and see how best to move with speed, to station themselves strategically to cover China in the best way possible. So some strategies as a way of closing, and one is, of course, to understand that China, US, and Africa are not operating in isolation. There is a bit of geopolitical interests that are here, and African journalists must understand where this is coming from, how it is evolving, and potentially where it is going in order for them to fully brief their audiences. Initiatives like the Belt and Road of China, people should understand, what is this? Where is it going? Why are more African countries signing up to the Belt and Road with each passing week? What are the implications for the continent? Then there is the area of relationship building. How do we build relationships with the Chinese news sources, with the US news sources, beyond the traditional official, beyond the embassies? And here I'm thinking about, scholars, even non-governmental organizations, and even business persons that African journalists can leverage. And also, there are also some cultural exchanges that are happening now between China and the US, Africa and China, and Africa and US. These cultural exchanges ensure that journalists have access to these places, so they can be able to understand really what is the political, economic, social organizing of these economies, so that they are better able to report. There is opportunity also for African journalists, I think 30 to 40 that are granted scholarships to study in China. So I think these are some of the ways that African countries and citizens can be able to report better on China. And finally, leverage on local access to information laws, where you think it is difficult to get information from China. For example, the claim that I've heard a lot of times. Most times it's about China getting into a contract with an African country. And you hear journalists complaining, China is not providing information. How about the country that went into contract with China? Is your country providing the information that China is not providing? because otherwise you should be able to get this information really from your own government. And where this is possible through access to information clauses, you as a journalist or practicing can invoke some of these clauses to get this information out without necessarily blaming other forces that are beyond the borders of your jurisdiction as a reporter. So I think I will leave it there for now. If there are more comments, you can handle that during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Adhere. And personally, I have lots of points and issues to discuss, not just from you, but from the rest of the colleagues. But I think I'll kind of avoid the temptation of weighing in too much and actually go to the question and answer box and look at what colleagues attending this have said. I think there's a colleague called Kennedy Jawoko, whom I suspect I know from various other interactions, and is posing the question to Puso and Mboya and Cliff. How can we understand Confucian thought when the entire education system on the continent is sourced or is Western? So in essence, is actually bringing in the issue of ideology from a cultural and therefore education perspective, that should it become a required course for journalist students on the continent so that we're able to understand China, appreciate basic Confucian ethical concepts and practices. And I think Kennedy must be weighing in from the point of view that journalism follows, cultural and philosophical nuances. And that if you do not understand where a community is coming from, you might struggle. But let me not weigh in too much. Cliff, and then Puso next.
Thank you, Bob, for that question. I think it is a valid question from Kennedy. And I think there's nothing wrong with trying to learn and understand about the world beyond us. And we know for a fact that we are influenced a lot by the Western society. And this is one of the colonial legacies that we have in terms of language, how we think and how we do our things. And now China is coming in a strong way and is trying to, so you can look at it in different ways. So this is an opportunity to maybe compare and contrast and maybe adapt and reject some things that work for us and some things that don't work for us. It also gives us an opportunity to reflect on, like, who are we, what do we stand for? And, like as an African, what defines you, So I think there's nothing wrong with trying to understand Confucian thought and, their development, ideologies and political thought and such like things. But I think it is very wrong if this is made compulsory in university. I think this should be a personal interest rather than institutional interest. So it is unfortunate if that happens. But I think, we need to understand that we can't pick sides. At the end of the day, we also need to define our interests. So, China is China is the biggest trade partner in most African countries. So it is not a country that you can ignore, So it is important for us to understand their language, to understand how they think, their development trajectory and their development plans and how we can maybe benefit or learn, So I don't think it is wrong. It is only wrong if it is compulsory, but I think it's important for those who are interested to engage with them to have an. And I'm not saying that we learn their language so that when they come maybe to Africa, we're able to speak to them. No, they should also learn our language. When they come here, they speak our language. When we go to China, we also speak their language. So we engage on that level so that you are not influenced too much by these foreign ideas and foreign incentives and lose ourselves in the process. So that is what I would say about that for now.
Okay, I think let's have Puso on the same question. Your response? I think, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. I think it doesn't have to be taught. One of the issues that I've learned as a journalist is that you need to, what you are taught at school takes only maybe 30% of your life as a journalist. The rest is up to you. So journalists should make it a habit that they learn these things. If you're interested in China and the US or China and Africa, you need to read more on China and Africa. And that is the starting point. There is a lot of literature on China, the political thought, the cultural values, or on the web. And I think for me, the only good journalist is the one who reads, even issues, even on issues that they are not publishing a story on. So it's always important that African journalists immerse themselves, especially on China, since we see Chinese footprints all over Africa, all over African economies, the social sphere. And yeah, I think it doesn't have to be introduced as a subject. And that would be my take.
Thank you. Thank you, Puso. I think let's move to the next question in the interest of time. And I think it's Kennedy again, this time around talking about the famous Chinese journalism going out in the form of constructive journalism. And I think Cliff was mentioning earlier about peace journalism. There is this concept of that, constructive journalism is better than watchdog journalism or journalism that's negative, that doesn't resolve issues, that stops at pinpointing problems without offering solutions. And I think Kennedy is asking that question very broadly in that sense, but also adding if there is constructive journalism courses on the continent, and what role do African journalism professors play in designing such a course? I think, first of all, just very quickly jumping in personally as a journalism lecturer and professor, is to say I haven't seen any course on exclusively on constructive journalism, at least not at WIT, and I know not quite in many South African universities. And I suspect around the continent, there isn't a specific course called constructive journalism. I think constructive journalism might be taught as part of the other offerings on the menu, as it were. But I want to perhaps ask Gregory also to weigh in on this question more broadly. I think there are distinctions in the genres of journalism. And I think Amo as well, being a media scholar, I think the two of you can do justice to that particular question. Welcome. Starting with Gregory.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, I think the first thing is to ask ourselves what constructive journalism means. I've looked at some of the definitions. Basically, with China, they say, they just want to report Africa in a constructive way, as opposed to how the United States have been reporting Africa. Meaning, let's say, trying to expose the good things about Africa as opposed to the United States. If that's the definition for constructive journalism, in my opinion, I think it starts with African journalists themselves. How do they constructively report Africa? And this would also, of course, discourage the idea of just collecting stories from news wires to report for themselves, by trying to develop a story for themselves. Trying to write a story that actually has value to their own people. And this is where we go back to our own cultural values and a rigorous African journalism curriculum to some extent. So that's my idea. It's still we haven't yet defined what constructive journalism is. And I think that's what we have to do.
Okay, I think those are interesting points. I can also actually jump in here to say the constructive journalism, Chinese constructive journalism, as was being crafted, in fact, at Communication University of China, where I studied myself, arose actually out of the idea that Western media is negative, Chinese media is positive. And journalism can either be just negative or just positive. And so the idea of constructive journalism came in. And that is perhaps one of the definitions, but I know there was talk of the Scandinavian model, which is the psychological aspect of of journalism. But I think let's have Amu also weigh in with her perspectives on this. Amu? Yeah.
So my perspective on constructive journalism is that we need to be analytical when we look at our stories. So as journalists, we need to be aware that there are always two sides to the story and the truth. So whenever we give the audiences stories, the stories need to be analytical. We need to make sure that we are covering all the areas when we give our audiences stories. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we are doing well for time, but we just have actually not doing very well. We have about 4 minutes, and we want to respond to all the questions. So I think this next one will go best to Adhere because it touches on the third one from Reward. I believe both superpowers, USA and China, are guided by their geopolitical interest in deploying soft power in Africa. And I think he or she is pointing out the fact that journalism need not pander to soft power too much and forget its critical watchdog role and vice versa. And that there's a lot of corruption in most African countries, that it's the duty of our African media to expose any type of malfeasance in our societies. And so, Adhere, I think you get the gist of it. It's a long question, but I guess you get the point. Right. That we can end up discussing soft power and related concepts of influence and forget the role of journalism. Okay.
Thank you. I think even when we talk about what these powers are doing in Africa, the idea is to generate a responsive African agency that can give value to the African citizens. So my looking at it is journalism doesn't take place in a vacuum. Journalists are human beings. They work within frameworks that regulatory frameworks that are done with other institutions within the societies they operate in. So it is important for journalists to play a role that builds society rather than destroys, in my view, and that is the idea maybe that constructive journalism borrows from. But that doesn't take away their responsibility to reveal the ills that are committed in a society as a way of constructing that society. So they just have to be responsible. And I think there is something, within the ethics that have been defined by different societies. They can do their job and benefit their societies without really pandering to the external forces that include these kind of powers that we are now seeing jostling for influence in Africa.
No, thank you, Adhere. I think you're touching on an interesting point, and this is a question that an issue that has been discussed over and over again. The whole question of African agency and African agency from a journalistic and media perspective, I think has not enjoyed as much traction as has African agency from an IR diplomacy and in related areas of geopolitics and so forth. So I think that there's an interesting intersection between Africa-US geopolitics and journalistic agency. We generally have journalistic agency in the broader field of journalism and media, but not quite in these Africa-US-China engagements. And I think, but that actually then takes me to the next question. And I think I'll cycle back to Cliff and Gregory again. There's a colleague who is asking about this whole issue of human rights. It's a big issue in the Africa-China-US intersection of things, particularly because the whole idea of the democracy summit that the Biden administration is busy putting together, I think the Chinese human rights issues will be top of the agenda, not just in terms of Africa-China, but Africa and China as a collective, or China in Africa in that matter. So I wonder how you'll weigh in, because Toby seems to say we seem to be leaning towards saying we must understand Chinese human rights without looking at the notion of Western human rights and maybe even African human rights. What will be your take? Let's start with Cliff.
You can hear me now, right?
Sure.
Yeah, just to be straightforward, I think the point is, the US should not define human rights for China, and neither should they define human rights for Africans. And the Chinese should also not define human rights for Africans and the US as well. So I think, you know, they are universal human rights, you know, but then it is not that universal. You know, there are contextual issues that need some kind of proper understanding. You know, there are cultural issues that relate to human rights. And we've had this discussion. For example, we've had an issue with Western countries when it comes to child labor. You know, African societies, children are part of, you know, the production in the community. You take your kid and you work together in the farm, it's labeled human rights, but Africans are like, what are you talking about, you know? So those kind of issues. So I think the major point is no power should come and try and impose its own cultural perspectives, because I've already mentioned there's a cultural element to human rights. So human rights should not be defined from a Western ideological or cultural perspective. Neither should it be defined from a Chinese cultural and ideological perspective. So we should be very careful. And it doesn't mean that appreciating Chinese human rights and norms when evaluating its development means ignoring some of maybe violations that happen, but we should understand ourselves when they come to invest here, like these are our human rights values, and these are the things that you need to do when you're here. They may be applicable in China or in the US, but they may not be applicable in China. So we need just to define those in context, and I think the debate should settle on that. But I think with this trilateral relationship, this is a debate that will go on for a long time, because it's power play. Everyone wants to impose their views and their influence. So it is a debate that will continue for some time.
No, I think I'll stop at where you have just stopped us. I mean, I'll start from where you stopped, which is that debate. It is like the egg and chicken. It is gonna go on for long. But Gregory, you can weigh in. Then I think we'll bring in Puso as well. So Gregory, on the issue of human rights.
Yes, for me, I'll just add on what Dr. Clifford said. I think the first thing is to be able to appreciate the variations in human rights and their understanding. So how does China approach this? How does the United States look at this? And also, how does Africa approach this kind of human rights? And the most important thing is to understand where we are operating, let's say as journalists. Am I writing a story about Africa? What's their context? You know, so if somebody from the United States is writing about Africa, they need also to appreciate the value of where they're operating from. If an African goes to China or the United States to report, they also need to understand that context. You know, the problem is that when we go to, let's say, we come to the United States or we go to China, we do not apply our African values. I mean, we never think of that. But when they come to Africa, they want to apply those values. I think that's where it's problematic.
Okay, I think again, the issue of universality versus locality, a big issue. But Puso, you want to also weigh in on this matter as we go towards the end, actually. Yeah. You can unmute. I think you need to unmute. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Bob. I'm saying I was raising this issue because this is one of the defenses that the Chinese use when they're confronted with this human rights question. But for me, human rights are universal. So you can't say as a Chinese contractor or a Chinese miner in Africa, I'm doing this to your people because in China, this is not part of our human rights nomenclature. I don't think that works. So I believe in the universality of human rights. Thank you.
Okay, you can see already that seems to even open up the debate even as we go towards the closure, because on the one hand, Gregory and Cliff are saying human rights are region, country specific. Puso is saying not quite. I suppose, you see, by the way, for our audiences, our colleagues who are on this call are actually going to do think pieces that will be published, and we'll be looking for those debates even there. And there's no harm in coming back to these topics at a later stage. I think I'll just have one last comment, and I think I'll invite anybody to chime in to contribute. And I think this is a colleague I believe I know called Beatrice. I think she's talking of, I think this is directed, in fact, to Amu. She's saying Amu raised the subject of Agenda 2063. How much do journalists take to understand the priorities therein set and the progress on forming one Africa common market? And I think the rest is very much agreement on Africa agenda. So Amu, you can weigh in, then we can go towards closure.
Thank you, Bob. So I believe that the first thing that we need to look at is what are those collective interests that are written in this Agenda 2063 blueprint? Because at the end of the day, when we say the Africa we want, we all need to be in agreement of what exactly is it that we are looking at. So by starting with the collective interest, journalists will be able to understand and also be able to scrutinize the document clearly. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the starting point on Agenda 2063 sometimes is usually just about 7 aspirations, and they fall into economic, social, and political pillars. And I think the interesting thing for journalists perhaps is to look at the 10-year implementation plan. I think now it's in its 3rd year. And obviously, this is something that can actually form the starting point in our engagement with China and the US, if we are talking of an African starting point or an Afrocentric position, in fact. But I think we've had a good time. We were overshot by a couple of minutes. So I will actually then go towards concluding this session by asking everybody to give us their final thoughts, their final comments, their closing remarks. And I think this time around, we can shift things a bit and start with Amu.
Thank you. So my final thoughts on this is that as African journalists, we need to engage in meaningful debates surrounding the trilateral relationships. So it is also important that as Africans, we create our own common African media where we can meet as journalists and discuss issues that affect Africa and how we are going to frame them in the media. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think that's the whole question of an African media is one that people have worked on, tried, attempted many years. But I'll be very keen to listen to Amu's idea on how we can create an African media. But for now, Adhere.
Thank you very much, Bob, again. I think as we go into the future of China-Africa-US relationship, I think the media will play a very key role in terms of informing, also educating, their audiences on what's happening. So I believe the African media really has a role to play, and they don't have to be beholden by the traditional narratives. They have to chart new paths, they have to see new strategies, and they have to define new lenses of looking at all these powers, even beyond China and the US. Because Africa for long has been beholden to these external forces. And I believe journalism is one way of explaining and breaking away from that past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to, as I mentioned earlier, and I need to re-emphasize this, the colleagues who are on this webinar today are going to put together pieces, articles, in fact, that provide some direction in how journalists can approach the 2 big powers, the US and China. So that we are not always saying, no, look, these powers are too big for them to actually take a position on them. Rather, we follow what they say and so forth. So I think this is just the first in a series of activities related to this. Let's have Puso also then give us his closing remarks. Puso? I hope Puso needs to unmute if he's muted. Right, okay.
Okay, thank you, Bob. I think for me, African journalists need to really take control of the narrative. The focus should not be so much on the big power competition between the US and China, but the beneficial effects of their presence in the African continent. I think that's what African journalists should focus on. We know the challenges of African media, underfunding, And I think we can deal with that later, but they should be objective also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Puso. I think let's come to Gregory. Your final remarks.
Yes, for me, I think African journalists should see this relationship not as a problem, but as an opportunity for them to thrive. So going back to what Puso said, I think being able to identify and also defining our own narrative within the competing powers would be the most important thing to do. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that is a sharp and to the point. And so, Cliff.
Yes, Bob. I think it was very important that the African Center for the Study of U.S. TWITS and the Africa-China Reporting Project thought about this topic. I think it is a very important topic that should be sustained. And the problem is these discussions are still at academic level, and I think we should try and push it more to the local levels, to the journalists, and even to the local community so that we keep it going. And I noted that there are some initiatives that have started, but they are maybe disjointed or unlimited. And if we just sustain this and empower them, then this process can move and we can be able to start implementing the ideas that you are talking about. You know, I know about the Pan-African Media Network project, for example. You know, I've just mentioned the Africa-China reporting project that is trying to do some of these things, which is very important. You know, we have the Bloomberg Media Initiative, as much as it is US led, but then there's an Pan-African element. So these initiatives are there, but then we just need to push on so that they gain traction, so that we begin to see the benefits. But for me personally, I think ultimately the African Union needs to play a leading role to this, because that is where African interests converge. So I think we should try and push our leaders, and especially the African Union, to try and maybe foster this, this debate and this narrative, so that we begin to see some of these ideas being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff. And I think this is where we come to the end. In closing, I would like to just again go back to the point that I've mentioned time and again, that this initiative is not a one-off. To start with, the next year at around this time we'll be back again. But even before next year, we have a series of activities lined up in the Africa-China-US area. One is, as our colleague Barry Van Wyk mentioned earlier, with our colleagues here, we are forming a team. We are going to produce knowledge on how a very pragmatic manner in which journalists can be more effective and efficient in covering the China-US-Africa story, which is complex. So we've just really touched the surface. We couldn't go in deep. We elected for breadth rather than depth. And I think the pieces will actually help us to go more vertical rather than the horizontal event that we've had today. I would also like to just mention very quickly that as a center, the African Center for the Study of the US, we have in July and into August our Africa-US-China engagements, which will go beyond just journalistic and media narratives into the fireworks of the collision and divergence, the convergence and divergence and the schisms and areas of agreement and so forth. But I think I would like to thank very much our panelists. You did a fantastic job, and we look forward, in fact, to reading your pieces. And I'm hoping that even after those pieces, if we so wish, we can actually come back again and narrow the scope perhaps onto a specific topic rather than doing an overarching kind of session. And with those few remarks, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch again via other means. Cheers and bye.